At the heart of it, though, ultimately must be a resolution of the situation in Ukraine. And whether we like it or not, that resolution is going to be largely on Russian terms. Right? That's the realistic outcome. And I know that there's a lot of people who'll be watching this who will find that proposition disconcerting and uncomfortable for lots of reasons. And that's why I preface it by saying whether we like it or not, um, without Russia's buy-in to the solution for Ukraine, there will be no solution for Ukraine.
Mm.
Uh, and that's just where we're at.
I have a very special guest with me today to talk about where we are at with the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, and that is Warwick Powell. Welcome back to the show, Warwick.
How are you, Jeff? Great to be back with you.
Indeed. And indeed, from my perspective, I feel to some degree that scenario is, well, in many ways quite likely, or at least there's a kind of a state failure going on right now in Ukraine. And that is actually a common ground for the, or particularly Europe, Russia, and the United States, because I don't think it's really in any of those parties' interests to have a collapsed, dysfunctional second largest country in Europe, Ukraine. And in some ways, I think it's also part of the problem with some of the advocates, I guess, of Russia just pushing on and, winning on the battleground. I think they forget that, war is politics continued by other means, and you actually have to think about what the political solution is. And at some point, there's going to have to be a construction of some kind of process to reconstruct some kind of functional Ukrainian state after this war. So, and to me, that's I feel that is part of also the sense of urgency people have with the recent summit, because I think things are getting really quite difficult there.
Well, quite clearly, they're getting very difficult. As I said, I don't think any of these meetings would have happened had reality not become brutally undeniable. And that reality will continue unfolding. I think if you follow, many people who go over the battlefield details in incredible detail, it's quite clear that the collapse is gathering pace, that attrition is actually having its effects, which is ultimately creating permanent weaknesses in the system. And they can't be papered over. There are insufficient men, there are insufficient munitions, insufficient machines. And the Western military industrial complex has no way of replenishing that at the same rate that they are being attrited. So when that collapses at some point, then you look at topography, right? So after the fortified lines, there's not much left. And that will mean that territory then gets gobbled up very, very quickly. So where does this all end up? Well, if it keeps on going, and I think I mentioned in that paper back in February or in our discussions that that one possible scenario, and not an unrealistic one, I think, is that this doesn't end until there is a change of regime in Kiev in a way that is satisfactory to Moscow. Now, how that happens is a different question, right? But and that happens either in a less bloody way or a more bloody way. But it's hard to see how Moscow ultimately would accept a Ukrainian polity that didn't have a Russia-friendly regime, doing the business out of Kiev. Once and if we actually understand that that is really part of the settlement, then it's hard to imagine a world in which the current regime can sustain itself. regardless of the process that's likely to unfold over the next month or 2 months or 3 months.
Mm.
Now, I think the real issue then, you talk about the reconstruction, right? I mean, part of the challenge of the legacy of these conflicts, I think, is going to be, particularly in a place where there are some very, very deep feelings about things.
Mm.
I don't just mean the consequences of war per se, but the things that led up to war, right? The passionate hardline nationalists um, uh, will likely continue resistance for as long as they possibly can. They will do that in ways that are, commensurate with their capabilities, which will typically involve, terror.
Mm.
Um, and so even if formal hostilities ended at some point, you probably got years of dealing with terrorism to look forward to. Now, and
And indeed, that's already spilling over into Europe now. I mean, there was the incident with the black and red flags in Poland, where people were expelled from the country. There's been issues raised in Czech Republic, Czechia, as well. It's one of the concerns, the sort of Ukrainian dissidents have, is the extreme Nazis have been sort of armed and valorized and given refuge in Europe, and it will be a potentially a very significant problem.
yeah,
So
and the
yeah.
problem won't just be contained to the territory known as
Mm,
Ukraine, right?
mm,
Because uh, terrorists, will find refuge where they need to find refuge
mm,
to organize and to conduct the campaigns that they fervently believe in,
mm,
and which means that those who seek to counter these campaigns will, in the end, need or feel compelled to root out these elements, even if they are holed up in other countries.
yeah,
And,
yeah,
and so there will be, in a sense, a contagion effect and a
mm,
spillover effect, not just of the refugees who've left Ukraine over the course of the last 3 years, but actually the dissipation of terrorist cells right across Western Europe, who
absolutely.
will then launch their terror campaigns
Yeah,
from those bases.
yeah, totally. And I feel part of the game being played between the European states, including Britain, and the US at the moment is it's a bit of a pass the parcel game where they don't want to be end up with the blame with being the person who allegedly has stabbed Ukraine in the back,
Yeah.
which I think is actually one of the cards both Ukraine and Europe actually does have in these sort of negotiations. It has a lot of negative influences, that particular issue, I think, but I think that is absolutely one of the dynamics in the diplomatic positioning of everyone. The European states are, going, like the captain going down with the ship kind of thing.
Yeah, so the easiest thing from the US's point of view, so if each of the actors wants to avoid blame,
Mm,
the US has clearly exercised first mover advantage here,
mm,
and is positioned now to pass the baton to the Europeans by saying that if you want to keep fighting this, we'll sell you the arms, but we're not committed to financing this adventure anymore. And the minute they do that, of course, they can wipe their hands off it. And of course, there'll be cries of betrayal and all those things. And the US will, in the first instance, say, no, no, we're still supplying the hardware. But as time goes on, I think we all know that those hardware supplies will trickle. The constraints of the production systems will become apparent. America will have its own priorities away from the European theatre. And as the war continues to fail in Ukraine, the Americans will actually say, look, we gave the Europeans, all the assistance that they asked for, and they've fumbled it. They've made a
mm,
mess of it, and it's just a bit of bad luck, but they stuffed it up.
Mm.
And that's where this can end up. Now, if you think about this from a time frame point of view, Jeff, we are at the first eighth of this presidential term, which means there are 3.5 years left of blame avoidance at the worst, right? Which means dragging this thing out for a long time, so long as Washington doesn't get blamed for it. And it's not just blame in any generic sense. The challenge that, and obviously from a personal legacy point of view too, but the challenge for Washington, I think, at this current moment historically, is that any perception or any added perception that it is militarily not as strong as the brochure says they are feeds into the accelerating dynamics of multipolarization, which the US is trying desperately to put the brakes on. So so Washington is has a set of different priorities, right? It wants to not only avoid blame because it doesn't want to look bad and responsible, morally culpable, and all those sorts of things, but it's actually got something else at play here, and that is it cannot afford to be seen as ultimately a Potemkin military, right, which is all front or all tip and no iceberg. And so it will be driven by some slightly different sets of interests to Europe. Europe is not that materially important to Washington, provided that it can force at times Europe to do certain things. So as we've been discussing, it's never quite as straightforward as daddy telling the children what to do. The children do have a mind of their own, even if that mind is heavily subordinated to the wishes of others.
One of the common issues identified in many people's sort of, I guess, longer term vision for resolving the conflict is, a new security architecture in Europe. The fundamental root cause, people say, is eastward expansion of NATO, and I guess the disregard of Russian security interests as part of the Western Eurasia. It does strike me that that is an extraordinarily complex problem to solve, especially when you view it in a global context, because, if we want to renegotiate the post-1945 security presence of America in Europe, why don't we renegotiate the post-1945 security presence of America in the West Pacific? If I were a Chinese diplomat, that would be the first thing I'd sort of say in response to that. So it's very complex to solve. And probably it strikes me, given that America is sort of making baby steps into diplomacy. I mean, I don't know if there's been a significant sort of conflict resolution summit held on American soil for a very long time. It does seem to be perhaps too big and complex and long-term an issue to be solved, at least with the current team. So I wonder, thinking constructively, how could one potentially break down this sort of big problem of security architecture of Europe into perhaps more manageable pieces that could actually be delivered through, a staged series of agreements, perhaps?
Well, clearly resolving the Russia question is central to it. And that can be resolved with or without NATO. Clearly, there are forces in Europe that are hostile to NATO as well. So there are active campaigns about the need to disband NATO. There is no reason for NATO to exist after the end of the Cold War, etc., etc. Needless to say, of course, countering that is the sort of fear-mongering or the genuinely held fears of Russian expansion. Right, so you've got a very febrile environment now to try to resolve uh, deep-seated animosities both ways and total lack of trust. Um, if you look at the really practical stuff, uh, you know, missiles pointed towards your capital. Let's start with that. Addressing the medium-range missile question is necessary. That's an important first step. The second step is to resolve the extent to which the Americans and or NATO continue to agitate in the liminal states that currently continue to sit in the liminal lands in between Western Europe proper and Russia. So that's the second issue that you can practically address, which is that persistent destabilization of the Russian fringes. That needs to come with not just security guarantees in a narrow sense, but perhaps needs to be wrapped up in a broader discussion around what security is all about. Security in some ways, of course, is about minimizing the risk of conflict, but if security isn't also in the name of enabling prosperity, then really what's the point of it? To be pure and poor doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me. It doesn't exercise the human capacity very, very much at all. So how do we refashion an economic redevelopment program that gives real prospects to the people who live in these liminal areas, whether it's in Georgia, of course, as we've been discussing in Ukraine itself, and then into some of those areas more towards the south. So there's some very practical things that can be done there. There are questions around the location of troops, but I think quite clearly the Russian attitude now is that if NATO and other NATO member troops built up on the border with Russia, then Russia will respond accordingly with its own build-up of troops on those borders. Because that sort of counterbalances each other out, I think any settlement can kind of live with that. But it's the ability to locate missiles in places that can then create that sort of the serious unsettlement. So I think that there are obvious things that need to be done. There are other things that can be done that will, in a sense, signal the beginnings of a more constructive relationship, and they're often more symbolic than anything else, but necessary in the language of diplomacy, where a lot of things happen through gestures and small actions that prove commitments to do certain things. Of course, there have been aborted discussions around normalization of relationships in terms of embassies and consulates and things. That's small stuff. There's the question of frozen Russian assets, right? That can actually be dealt with relatively straightforwardly as a constructive gesture. It doesn't undermine anything. It really, $300 billion isn't going to make a jot of difference in the grand scheme of things, but nonetheless, it's an important gesture. Then there are questions around the various sanctions, and there's 26,000 of them, right? So there's a lot, and that actually offers an incredibly rich array of materials where trust building can be entertained one small step at a time. In fact, there's 26,000 plus small steps at a time that could be entertained around those sorts of things. So there's a lot that can be done that individually never seems too much, but nonetheless starts to move the capacity for parties to engage with each other along. At the heart of it, though, ultimately must be a resolution of the situation in Ukraine. And whether we like it or not, that resolution is going to be largely on Russian terms. Right? That's the realistic outcome. And I know that there's a lot of people who'll be watching this who will find that proposition disconcerting and uncomfortable for lots of reasons. And that's why I preface it by saying whether we like it or not, without Russia's buy-in to the solution for Ukraine, there will be no solution for Ukraine. And that's just where we're at.
I sometimes wonder too whether maybe, I mean, we tend to talk about NATO and European security as a whole, but whether it could also perhaps be broken up a little bit to talk about reassurances for the sort of East European states, the Visegrad sort of states, kind of the Baltics, plus and Hungary, Slovakia, and potentially Czechia, not in the not too distant future, will all be sort of wanting to have a more constructive security sort of arrangement, probably with Russia. So whether and those states have also been amongst the most ideologically driven within the NATO alliance, and I'd say probably manipulated by people whose security interests are sort of off the coast of Western Europe. So yeah.
Look, one of the challenges is obviously deep-seated historical Russophobia. Right now, that's not going to disappear very quickly, but without calling it what it is, and then thinking about how that affects relations with a geographical neighbor that you can't get rid of, there's always going to be some limits as to what can be done. Part of the problem is actually the way that the United States has viewed Europe as an extension of its own empiric interests. If you looked in West Pacific Asia region, notwithstanding the American presence militarily, that hasn't stopped an incredible amount of economic integration between China, Japan, Republic of Korea, and right through Southeast Asia, ASEAN. The Americans haven't been able to stop China's development, notwithstanding recent efforts to contain it. So economic integration has continued with a full head of steam in Asia, notwithstanding the American presence. The problem in Europe is that the Americans could not countenance the idea that there is deep and economic alignment and collaboration between Russia and Western Europe. And this goes to Russia's role as an energy provider, which was seen to be anathema to American geopolitical and commercial interests in Western Europe, to a point where the pipelines were blowing up. Right. So unless you can get to a point where you can re-establish these economic relationships, which in some ways are your lowest hanging fruit. So trade is actually something that's not too hard to do, even when parties don't get on that well. Right. Funnily enough, trade can persist despite many, many differences. And so trade, in a sense, is the easiest thing to get up and running again. Then investment flows become more difficult because of stability issues and paranoias around security implications of having foreign-owned firms in different countries. So investment's a long way off, but trade is certainly one. Enabling people to move, I think, is also quite important. Re-establishing cultural connectivity. At the outset of the war in Ukraine, a whole bunch of Russian cultural dimensions were in effect banned, right? And I don't just mean in Ukraine itself, which had its own sensibilities around it, but right across Western Europe and in North America, where the Bolshoi Ballet was banned, where Russian nationals who were performers in artistic troupes basically got run out of these performances, where Russian sports people were denied the ability to play under the Russian flag.
Mm.
Now, all of these things can actually be unwound because without reconnecting people again, it's actually very, very hard to create that more settled environment, an environment that is a little bit less paranoid and less hostile to each other. So, they're the sorts of things that need to, I think, come with a package deal. There's no two ways about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so important. I mean, I had Sheila Fitzpatrick, the eminent historian of the Soviet Union and Russia, on the show not so long ago, and one of her comments was, all academic exchanges have been kind of cut off at the moment. So people can't go to to Russia and understand the country. And it's sort of the reverse of what was going on even in some of the darker days of the Cold War. It's really quite an astonishing outcome. So I do think those people-to-people contacts are a genuine constructive thing, but it will require. I mean, we've just seen the media response to the summit, and the hysterical comments about Molotov Ribbentrop packs and all this kind of thing, and it will require some pretty steady and skillful political leadership to, I guess, start to change the tone of the conversation.
Look, and this is the pivotal question, is the political leadership that's needed, because I'm sure that there are plenty of organizations and institutions that would more than happily host these sorts of exchanges, whether they are in music or the arts or in education. But they need the political cover. They need to know that when certain quarters of a society react adversely to them playing this role, that they will be protected and defended at a political level and not hung out to dry. And in fact, that they are de facto implementing these exchanges as part of a broader program of rapprochement. Now, these things can be done. I mean, we've seen long-standing conflicts resolved step by step, inch by inch. China was able to facilitate a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That took a best part of 5 years, really, right? So it took a long time, but you can start normalizing the exchange of people, the exchange of ideas, and a reopening up to the prospects of having conversations and dialogue. Then you start getting things happening in the right direction. But again, until I think Ukraine is resolved in a way that acknowledges Russia's security interests, none of this is going to matter.
Yeah.
And the dilemma there, of course, is that what that really means is even if the Russians and the rest of the world will not say so, what it really means is a strategic Western defeat. And who wants to fly the white flag? Nobody. Right? This is one of the reasons why I think the Europeans are digging in so hard. Right? Nobody wants to acknowledge the defeat that's unfolding. Interestingly, I think it was about 2 years ago. Actually, it was when President Putin was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he was asked about this question of dignity and humiliation and things like that. And Putin was quite clear that he believed that there were ways, but it's really up to the West to imagine how it could settle this in a way that will settle the West's own sense of what dignified defeat means. Because at the end of the day, what is this sense of shame and loss of dignity and humiliation? Well, it's actually the sense that you feel when you're in that position, right? Because that's what you think other people think of you. Other people have their views anyway. Right? But I think the lessons that have been learned by Russian officials, at the very least, if not people in the general populace who little bit more emotional, I guess, about these things is that with victory comes a level of responsibility, and with that also comes the need to be magnanimous. Otherwise, you've just laid the seeds, sowed the seeds for the perpetuation of conflict. Right?
Yeah. Yes, I think I wrote in one of my first written pieces after being unable to publish public servant that the challenge for the BRICS states was to defeat America without humiliating America, and I guess defeat NATO in a way. And I guess that sort of story is sort of being played out at the moment. So, and things like Putin saying, yes, it was Biden's war, even though he surely knows it wasn't just Biden's war. I think are good examples of that. In fact, I looked into this remark that he made at the press conference and what the actual call, what the conversation he was referring to. And it was actually the conversation he had with Joe Biden about 2 weeks before the special military operation began. So it was sort of like, Joe Biden, the readout was basically, this is your last ultimatum, Vladimir. And the readout from the Russian side was totally different. I mean, there was no reference to the Russian point of view in the American readout, but the Russian point of view was raising all the issues about root causes and, NATO and collective security and the potential catastrophic consequences of bringing nuclear states to conflict. So it's an interesting.
This sense of insecurity, you've got to respect people having that sense of insecurity, right? So I think the Russians, having experienced it themselves, are compelled to also acknowledge that others have a sense of insecurity about them. That's the nature of the beast. Their objection has been that no one's taken their senses of insecurity seriously, and ultimately, of course, they've responded to that. Where they literally believe that the survival of their state is at stake, and so they've responded in the only way that they can at this point. But this issue of the security or sense of insecurity that others now feel, and sitting here objectively, you can say that that might not be warranted, right? So you can, and I think quite reasonably, run the argument that says, look, the Russians don't have either the means nor the intent to go beyond what they're trying to accomplish. That's not going to assuage many people in Western Europe that that's the end of the matter. They will continue to hold the view that Russia's on the march. Russia, of course, has held the view that NATO has been on a march for years, and NATO has always said, "Oh no, we're just a defensive alliance. We've got, we're all good, and you've got nothing to be concerned about." Pleading that never gets you anywhere, and that's an important lesson to learn here, right? That both sides will have their own view, and once you actually understand that, you do, I think, realize that you've got to transcend this framing, and that means you must, at some point, start talking about indivisible security, because without having a serious discussion about indivisible security, where the security of one is not at the expense of the other, but is in fact intimately intertwined with the security of the other, you won't get over the fact that one side always feels insecure about the other side. And maybe that's where this particular conflict is going to drive the parties in Europe ultimately towards. It's not the first time. In 1975, the Helsinki Accord reached a whole range of important conclusions about indivisible security, and they were promptly ignored, principally ignored by the Americans and NATO, I might add. And of course, there was the window of opportunity in the 1990s after the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the dismantling of the Berlin Wall for a different European architecture to be fashioned. One that Gorbachev spoke of, the great European family, so to speak, But none of that happened. And again, we know why. There was no intent on the Western side of that particular decades-long conflict to take their foot off the throat. The opportunity.
I mean, going back to what we were saying before about divided executives, I mean, there were people who were actively advocating taking but they lost out in the internal arguments.
Yeah, exactly.
And which, I mean, I guess, which is an interesting reflection, maybe, as we draw to the end. I've just been reading or rereading this book here by Christopher Clark. I don't know if you know it, Sleepwalkers, How Europe Went to War in 1914. It's a fascinating sort of, kind of, I guess, the current definitive account of, the start of World War One, if you like. But one of the things it really emphasizes is this question of the divided executives of Europe. They were very complicated states with many different voices around foreign policy and very changeable perspectives within that, depending on who's prevailing at one time or the other, and with quite quirky sovereigns. King Kaiser Wilhelm of the Second of Germany, as I was reading the book, was sort of rather reminding me of Donald Trump. Sort of off the cuff remarks, and a person whose moods and perspectives had to be managed by his senior ministers. But he really emphasizes that, it wasn't an inevitable march to war, that there were actually seeds for a better future. In some ways, actually, the fact that it ended up as a war was a quite improbable scenario. So that, even in these, with all the malevolent actors and all the rest of it, there's internal arguments going on within all of these states to perhaps find that pathway towards collective security.
Yeah, and look, I mean, warfare in a funny kind of way is often the result of just chronic failure in statecraft, right? And so the sort of historical lesson to be learned is to try and understand what makes better statecraft compared to failed statecraft, because failed statecraft, the defining characteristic of failed statecraft is war. And to not be able to mitigate against the risk of war. And I guess that this is one of the emerging lessons out of all of this, is that not only has there been failed statecraft, but perhaps the art of statecraft has disappeared for very understandable reasons. When you no longer have a need for it, in the unipolar moment, then those skills are less desirable, and so there's no careers to be built in cultivating deep competencies, institutionalized competencies in statecraft. I was speaking with Ian Proud, the former British diplomat in Moscow, a couple of weeks ago, and we sort of reflected a little bit upon the hollowing out of the public service, particularly in the area of the foreign service, and that hollowing out basically destroyed the capability of that institution to cultivate the persona of the diplomat, right? So if you look at what a diplomat is, and the things that go towards effective diplomacy, these are skills that can be taught and learned, but they're not taught and learned anymore. Whether they're language skills, whether they're cultural skills, whether they're broader skills around curiosity about the other place. When the life of an embassy staffer is basically hooking up with other people from like-minded embassies, you've really lost the capacity for representation in other countries to build better understanding with other countries. And so this is where we're at. The other thing that I think is a little bit disconcerting all the time, and we see this a lot, there seems to be this sort of, maybe it's media driven too, but this sense that politicians constantly need to remind people that there are differences, right? So, we get the rhetoric of, we'll stand up when we differ. And it's just like, well, of course you will, but we're not really paying you to do that. What we're paying you to do is to advance our cause, and our cause is to have better livelihoods, more secure livelihoods, safer livelihoods, and improve prospects for the flourishing of our families and our communities. I really don't want to hear you spend your time emphasizing why you've got some difference with someone else. I actually want to know what you're going to do about improving the things that I've just articulated. But there's an obsession with reminding the world that we have these differences. Well, great, whoop-de-doo, I say, we've got our differences. But what are you going to do about them? Leadership isn't simply about saying we've got our differences. Leadership is actually about how we manage to get by and then get along, not just notwithstanding our differences, Jeff, but because of our differences, right? How does that actually feature in the frame today? And it doesn't really, right? And that, I think, is in many ways the epitome of the hollowing out of statecraft.